What can you actually control? Some people think they can control the outcome, but you can't.
Mm-hmm.
You could run, and most athletes listening, or anyone listen, have you ever had an unbelievable performance and lost? Have you ever performed poorly and still won? It's happened because we've got no control over the other people, the outcome that's going on with it. So you can't control the outcome. You can influence it. You can't control it.
Today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Phil Clarke about tackling mental health in sport. Dr. Clarke is an experienced lecturer and researcher and consultant in sport and exercise and performance psychology at the University of Derby, which is where he completed his own PhD exploring the role of psychological predictors in pressure performance. Phil's really got a passion for human performance and wellbeing and mental health, and supporting individuals to really be able to achieve their potential, whether that's in the classroom, the boardroom, or on the sporting field. Alongside his lecturing role, Phil is the current sports psychology lead both at Team Derby and the Derbyshire Institute for Sport, where he supports a range of elite athletes and coaches in their sporting ventures. He also applies these principles in other environments as well. He researches and provides a consultancy in a range of other performing domains, such as education, business, aviation, and military scenarios. Phil has presented his award-winning research both nationally and internationally at a range of conferences over the last decade, and he believes it's really important to ensure he continues to work over all of these areas to really be able to drive this through the discipline, and also ensure that his practice is scientifically informed with the latest research, and that thinking is able to support his clients but also to shape the performance environments. So Phil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe. I'll have you introduce me any other thing I do in the future. That was great. Thanks for that.
You're very welcome. So, Phil, where did this all start for you?
I guess before I got into, I wasn't very academic at all growing up. If you had asked my teachers if Phil Clarke would have made it to university, their answers would have definitely been no. It stemmed from just a passion in sport. Growing up, my dad was a well-known athlete as well, Gaelic football. He was well respected. I got into it myself, my sister and my brother. But I struggled, not due to ability, due to I couldn't get up here right. I couldn't get the top 3 inches, as I call it, right. So big matches, I felt the expectation of trying to live in my dad's shadow, trying to emulate him or be, and he was a very different athlete to what I was. So in big moments, I didn't necessarily turn up to the way I would have liked to. And it wasn't until I got hit with the realization, right, I'm going to university, that I wanted to study in sport. And I remember my very first lecture in sports psychology, where it was like, oh, wow, this is a thing. Okay. Yeah. And everything in my first module was just, yeah, I could have used that. I could have used that. I could have used that. And that's what I'm really passionate now about, supporting young athletes with it, because it is uncomfortable. It is challenging. It is pressure filled, especially when you're going through everything that life brings. So yeah, just have a real passion for supporting athletes in something that I went through and didn't necessarily have that support. Yes, I had support from family and friends and things like that, but not through a psychological lens, I guess.
Absolutely. I love that phrase, the top 3 inches. That's a new one on me, but I think I'm going to steal it. I can see Phil as well whilst we're talking. So he was pointing to the top of his head and referring to the executive functioning of his brain there. Yeah. And so, really that understanding that would have been so helpful to you earlier on in your career of why certain things happened in a certain way really started to dawn on you when you moved into higher education.
Oh, complete career change. So I'd initially come over to study sports science. Like I mentioned, I wasn't great at school and wasn't great at university. The only reason I got into university in the UK, so you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from Ireland, was because of my sporting credentials and my background. I got into a sports science course because purely you could write a personal statement in Ireland that you get a number, you get points for your grade, and that's it, whether you get in or not. So I knew I wasn't going to get into the courses I wanted to in Ireland. So I came over to the UK to study sports science, thinking I was going to do physiology or physiotherapy. And first lecture, first semester of uni, I changed my whole career career path that I knew it was psychology I wanted to go down. So yeah, I think in any profession you do, you want to find something you're passionate about. And I had that personal experience that I could connect with and go, not only is this something I enjoy from a professional perspective, it's just something I wish I knew back then.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, there are lots of different figures out there, but something that I'd read recently was it's reported about 35% of elite athletes actually suffered from disordered eating behaviors, burnout, anxiety, stress, depression. I'd have thought actually there's probably a lot more than that. And I think that that's possibly quite an underreported figure.
Yeah, I think that from a mental health aspect, I think athletes can sometimes be seen from the general population. So the way I look at sport is it's like the shop window of high performance, because everyone can see it, everyone talks about it. You think about kind of at a professional level, you'll have 70, 80,000 go to a stadium and they all talk about it in the pub afterwards, and it's on social media, and it's all that's talked about, and they have this image that they're invincible, but they're human beings. They have the same pressures that everyone else experiences, except their profession is under the lens of scrutiny from press, fans, and the whole lot. I think where the aspect of the reporting of it is one thing, because I do think there's an aspect that people don't report what they're experiencing. But I also think some aspect of it is understanding the difference between stress and pressure. And pressure is a fundamental part of that role. When there's any type of performance where there's an expectation, there's an outcome, and there's individuals watching, there is that natural pressure. So we don't want to shy away from that. So I know in the general population, when we talk about negative feelings, it's about trying to manage those and get to a more pleasant place. But when we look at sport, that pressure is inevitable. It's going to come, and it's more about managing it and getting on side with it and understanding why our body is going through what it's going through in terms of the intense butterflies, the self-doubt, the apprehension. That's a natural part of your body trying to keep you safe, your brain trying to keep you safe, but going, let's not go into this really scary environment. So what we're not trying to do is get rid of it. We're just trying to work with it. And that type of approach.
And I guess, we talk about that in education as well, don't we? We, from the work that Gareth and I've done, we talk about the difference between stretch and stress, and, the importance of that those intense butterflies, etc. And it's preparing you to go into this arena, but it's also there because it shows that you actually care about what you're doing. And being able to work in that. And when we worked with different programs in the university, we'd talk about it in different language, but in performing arts, we'd talk about that motivational energy. When we were looking at people who had academic anxiety as well, we'd talk about being able to recognize the difference and being able to work with that initial pressure, if you like, which is there, that you can use to help you drive you forward to succeed. But when that tips over into stress, then that becomes a different thing. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, 100%. And that is what we're trying to find, the balance. And it's understanding everyone has a certain capacity for those experiences where it becomes helpful. I try not to use like it's positive or negative. It's whether it's helpful or unhelpful. And you notice when it tips over the other side, it becomes unhelpful. And that's when it becomes problematic. When I love the way you term it, and it's very similar when with pressure, the reason we experience pressure is because we have a level of importance to it, importance of the outcome, importance of the image, importance of whatever. So if you're not experiencing that, I'm probably more worried, because does that mean have you fallen out of love with what's happening? And which happens in sport, where they have this identity, so they're doing it just because that's all they've ever known and they've got no passion for it. And that's even an even worse place to be in, almost. So it's almost trying to educate people, and particularly our younger athletes, that this is natural, that it's not something to be scared of. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but uncomfortable is okay. It's when it becomes unmanageable. That's when we need to I guess, take a different approach. I guess the challenging thing with sport is sometimes those failures that we can have, and I use that word because I think we shouldn't want to avoid it, because failure is inevitable in every performance context we feel in. We're human beings, we're fallible like any other, but those failures are very clear and open to everyone in a lot of others. So anything that's got performative in front of others, so the performing arts, definitely there's an audience, musicians, there's an audience. But if we think about it in the corporate world, you might be in an office that no one will notice those mistakes apart from your manager. That's not to say that we're diminishing the impact of it, But the reason I talk about it is that's another element of the stress beforehand, because it's not just me having to deal with what if this goes wrong. It's my teammates, the fans, the population watching, the implications this could have on contracts, because if I'm not performing well, I could be out the door. So it almost adds to that potential spiral of negative thinking of this could go wrong, this could go wrong, this could go wrong. And okay, it's helpful if we're using it as a motivator, but if we're using it as a detractor, then that's unhelpful. And it's that understanding.
It starts to impact on our perception of how well our needs are being met. If we draw it back to the human given needs, that sense of status, that sense of autonomy and control as well. And, that you're talking about teammates, part of that community of people as well. And when I've talked before about performance anxiety in terms of people giving presentations, when they're doing their vivas, and in the corporate world, if people are having to present, that's a really common thing as well. And that, the way I've framed it for people is that you remove yourself from the pack. We're pack animals, and if we suddenly feel that we're outside of that pack, then there's a huge sense of threat.
Oh, 100%. And I think it's Jerry Seinfeld's joke that more people are afraid of public speaking than they are of death. So actually, you'd rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy. And that highlights that the real importance of we are pack animals. We don't want to do something that's going to potentially isolate us or put us out, because that's our risk. Years and years ago, the reason was that is our physical safety. If we're left alone to fend for ourselves, we're at risk. The 8 hours we sleep, we're at risk in terms of we have to fend for ourselves in foods. All of that, our likelihood of death increases magnanimously. But actually, in today's society, it's a lot more safe physically, but our brain doesn't process it like that, because it looks at the emotional connection. And actually, we follow the exact same processes that I don't want to do something or say something that's going to make me seem silly, make me seem stupid, or me feel lesser. And therefore, I may be excluded from projects, excluded from teams, excluded from X, Y, Z. So again, these are natural human processes that are part of it, and everyone experiences the exact same things. And when we perceive it like that, and when you start to understand it, you can get on side with why your brain does that. It's natural. It's completely natural. And even though I've been doing this for years, I still get nervous when I go up and speak, because of course I am, but I can manage it. And it's helpful now. It's almost, oh no, this is good. This is me telling me I'm ready. That's all it is. And it's just very different. Just very different.
And I think that managing it is that comes into, when we, from a human giver's point of view, when we talk about resources, one of our great resources is our imagination. That's one of the things we see that, in all arenas we can use really helpfully, but it can also be quite unhelpful as well. And I imagine that in sport as well, I know the work that we did some work together, didn't we, over lockdown, actually, in the world of aviation. And we talked a lot about the imagination that pilots, when they were experiencing in their imagination certain things going wrong, so they had certain competencies that they had to achieve before they could get back up in the air, and they had to do some armchair flying, and then they had to do the sim test. And what was going on for them and in their imagination had a huge influence on the outcome of their performance. And I'm sure you see that in sport, we see that in academia, but we also see it socially for people as well, don't we, in their everyday lives. So if we're constantly concerned about the worst case scenario or imagining certain things going wrong, then our emotional arousal levels, our fight or flight, that perception of threat goes up.
And the one thing I say even with that is we don't want to shy away from that either, because there is benefit in seeing the worst case scenario, in the sense that, okay, you've seen it, what it could be at the worst, and you're still here and you're okay. Like it's not the end of the world. So there is an element that you'll see within some aspects where it's all about being purely positive. And I do see this with some of the let's say unqualified people in the mental space talking about performance, who will be saying, no, just stay positive, stay in this. And I'm like, I understand that. And there is benefit to it. But we also understand that sport and performance is an unsafe place, because there is validation, there is expectation, there is all of that. So if we just imagine purely the positive, it doesn't replicate what it's like in the reality when you're in there, because you are going to be sitting with those doubts. So a lot of the work I try and do is trying to almost make it real, like, okay, so you're experiencing those thoughts, that's okay. Now, how are we going to manage it? Because I can't stop those automatic thoughts, those automatic images coming into play. So let's give you the skills that when they do come in, how are you going to manage it?
Yeah.
So it's almost trying to get them to, instead of lean away from it, lean into it and still know that they're on a strong foundation. Because that's in essence what reality is going to be like. I don't think I've ever turned up to any performance and gone, I am perfect, I feel 10 out of 10, my performance outcome is going to be perfect, no one can stop me. Because the thing is, I've had situations where it's gone wrong before, so my brain will go, haha, yeah, you think, yeah, do you remember when this happened? And it's like, yeah, okay. So it's okay as long as we can get safety with it. And the way I try and explain it with our athletes, and I know it's difficult because it's on screen, but it almost like we're butting heads with that negativity and almost trying to avoid it, when actually let's get on side with it, use it from a learning way to go, yeah, that's natural, that could happen.
Yeah.
If it does see out that way, it's not the end of the world, I'm safe. But if I do find myself in that moment, what can I do to work with it? What are the strategies I can use in the moment? Let's practice them.
Yeah. But again, that's harnessing the use of the imagination. It's 100%. Imagining, being able to overcome those obstacles. And one of the things we talk about is guided imagery, mental rehearsal, things like that. But also rehearsing for tricky situations, rehearsing for what happens if this happens. And so that their brains had an experience of thinking about that and thinking about how they might overcome that if that problem does arise. Because I think you're right. If we just go along the lines of just rehearsing the positive, then that's not always helpful in every scenario. In some cases, we do need to think about. I know when I was doing work with students who were concerned about assignments or exams, and it was the total end of the world if they didn't pass, we'd think about, okay, so if that happened, then what?
Yeah.
That would be the narrative, the discussion that we'd have is, so if you do fail this exam, what does that mean for you? Do you get to retake it? Okay. If that goes wrong, do you have the option of, revisiting it next year? And going further and further down, so that we're making that scenario smaller and less pervasive than they might otherwise have seen initially to them.
And what we know, the research when it comes to imagery, like I'm a huge factor of using that imagination for it, because you can recreate the scenario effectively in your mind. And we know the evidence suggests that even in injury rehabilitation, you can actually recover quicker by effectively using imagery, because your brain responds and the body responds in a way that you're almost getting used to those neurons firing in terms of what that physical response will be, to the point that some athletes who've been injured and lead up to Olympics and all they can do is imagery, that recovery bounce back is quicker off the back of it, because they're keeping those lines of thinking, those kind of, when I think this type of reaction and response, it helps. And for anyone who doesn't believe that is the case, if you've ever had a nightmare where you feel like you're falling, why is it you wake up and your body's tense? Because your body feels that actually this is a reality. You've created a really powerful, strong image that evokes the physiological responses. You're sweating, you're tense, you feel tired because it's almost like you've been running. That's not real. You've created that powerful image, and that powerful image has created a physiological response in you. So if you're able to use that in a positive way, you can do the exact same.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Fascinating. I know when when we did a bit of work over lockdown, we were talking about mental rehearsal and about rehearsing success. And I remember you said that there was a study about runners, and they were imagining running the race, but they kept seeing themselves being beaten. Somebody running past them.
Yeah. So there's lots of so that I think was a case study.
Okay.
Scenario where you can see that, and that is common. That's common. When you're in those moments, you can think of worst case scenario, and it can lead to that same response that when it does happen, even if it's never happened before, but you've created it in your mind, it can still create that, oh, it's happening again, even though it's the first time. Because again, the images we create are so powerful and so creative, even to the point that, when how we make sense of scenarios, even if it didn't happen, but how you've made it up in your head that it's happened as a way of explaining it, that becomes that reality. So then the images almost seem like almost factual, and therefore have greater power behind it. So when you're recalling them, you're imagining all the worst case scenarios, because you're looking back at it from the emotional lens of maybe fear or anxiety or stress. So again, those images that we can create in our mind play a huge part in how we deal with future or present situations in terms of, again, let's try and create not comfortable scenarios, but helpful scenarios. So can you find your comfort in the discomfort?
Right.
When there's fire around here, what's your fire exit plan? Can you imagine what that's going to be? Well, you know, there's feelings of uncomfort. When you know that things around you aren't going as you plan, can you still see yourself making the right actions that are going to help you towards the goal you're trying to achieve?
Okay.
And it's trying to look on that.
Is that why it's so important then not to rehearse having already achieved something?
It depends what it's for.
Okay.
So I think if you're doing it for purely motivational purposes, so for example, if you've got a 5 o'clock training session and you're lying in bed, you focusing on the negative and the challenge might not be the most useful thing in the world. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna roll over. I'm half asleep anyway. So it's almost like it's a depends approach of the when and what of why you're using it. So there is a level of complexity to it that it's not just the same image every time, because it will lose its impact. It's knowing when and what and how behind it. So viewing the positive outcomes, and say, for example, that feeling of you winning a competition, you replaying that first thing in the morning before you get out of bed to go train, that can be a really powerful motivational tool. But actually, most of the images we've been talking about, they're not motivational in any sense. So what we're almost trying to do is create an image that's given instruction and guidance that allow them to almost have a coping mechanism that when it comes out, okay, great. So for example, it could be if you are focusing or worrying about the negative scenario that comes in that's proving unhelpful and leading you down a line, it could be, right, your coping mechanism is, for the next minute, I just want you to focus on an ideal race outcome.
Okay.
Just focus on that. So what we're almost trying to do is, whenever something negative comes in, you're building up that automation, that automatic habit of, okay, that's fine. Let's focus on what I can do, an ideal race outcome, and me performing through the adversity, or even some case, like imagine a perfect round. I'm not saying every time you have to focus on the negative, but it's also good to do that sometimes too. So focus on it going best case scenario, focus on a worst case scenario, focusing when different variations go wrong, because by doing that, you're developing comfort in it. So Michael Phelps is a great example. There's a video out there you can watch in one of his Olympics. I think it was a semi-final where his goggles broke. So his goggles filled with water, and it led, obviously, for a swimmer underwater, that's not ideal, particularly when you're turning at the end of laps. But they had rehearsed that in practice. So it didn't, yes, it was uncomfortable. Yes, it was a shock. I think he won the race and made it through. But you can see at the end of it, when he comes out, he's rubbing his eyes. He doesn't know kind of the outcome. It doesn't matter, because the practice he'd been doing was just, can't change that. This has happened. Now's not a safe time to worry about why that happened. It's just going into, what can I do about it? Right. Focus on what I can do. Focus on what my process is. Great. Practice it, rehearse it. And it doesn't have to be just in those performance environments, because life is full of stress.
Yeah. And I was thinking just that, we always say, when you're talking about managing uncertainty, it's rather than thinking about all the variables that you can't control, it's about being able to focus down on the things that are within your control, to be able to build that exit strategy from whatever it is that we're.
I use a model with the athletes I work with on that terminology of, it's 70, 20, 10, because you sometimes hear, if you can't control it, don't worry about it. Don't think about it. I can agree to some extent with that, but my challenge is, okay, it's raining outside. I can't control the weather, but I would like to know that it's raining. I can adopt my strategy off it. I'm just not going to spend a huge amount of time focusing on it. So 70% of the focus should go on what we can control. 20% should go on what we can influence, and 10% should go on what we've got no control over. But often we flip that around, and 70% of the focus goes on what we've got no control over. 20% stays on influence, but 10% goes on what we can control. So it's trying to shift the balance and really gain an understanding of, okay, what can you actually control? Some people think they can control the outcome, but you can't. You could run, and most athletes listening, or anyone listening, have you ever had an unbelievable performance and lost? Have you ever performed poorly and still won? It's happened because we've got no control over the other people, the outcome that's going on with it. So you can't control the outcome. You can influence it. You can't control it.
Yeah.
You can only control your process to it, and trying to show them, okay, well, what can you control? Your response, your reaction, how you manage it. fundamentally you.
Yeah. That's really powerful. I'm just thinking back to conversations I've been having this week with some supervisees. And, sometimes when working with trainee therapists, they'll come into supervision and they say, look, there's all of this stuff going on, and there's nothing that this client can do to change that situation. There's nothing I can do as a therapist to help them in that situation because their environment can't change. And I just feel really helpless. So we bring it right back down to, well, what is their goal, and what are they able to influence within themselves? What have they got control over in that time? We need to acknowledge the things that they don't have control over, absolutely. But bringing it back down to things that they can control, back down to their own physical and mental well-being, and what they can influence in terms of that. And that, framing it like that, really helps to increase their perception of control.
And understanding that there is wiggle room. Like, it's not that you can't think about those things. You can. It's natural. It's part of us that those thoughts about the things we can control will come into play. You're not going to be able to 100% of the time think about just the things we can control. So giving yourself the space to go, right, I can hit 70%.
Mm-hmm.
I can try and align it more within that role, and teaching them acceptance that I can't control it. Yes. And again, understanding the difference between need and want.
Yeah.
They meant to, look, I need to help them. No, you don't need to help them. You want to help them. Need intensifies. There is a do or die feeling to it. So you have that emotional response and reaction to it of intensity. You don't always get what you want, but you get the things you need. And fundamentally, when you look at that, the things that you need, the example I try and do with that is go, right, take a deep breath and hold your breath for as long as you can. And those last few seconds before you're almost craving for breath, that feeling of that's need. And you telling yourself that you need something is you living in that kind of feeling for the whole time. And it's very different to I want breath. Very, very different. So it's just kind of like the language we use internally can majorly influence the emotional response we have to things and the acceptance we have to things. Because the whole response and reaction around that, how you talk to yourself, how you set it up, how you set those expectations, that again, the need and want. I want to help all my clients. I don't necessarily need to. And that's not a bad thing. It's me knowing I will do everything I can. But if it doesn't work out, I'm not going to beat myself massively up over it, because some of the things are completely outside of my control.
Yeah. And again, something we talk about in therapy is the main things that influence therapeutic outcome. And quite often the initial thing that people say is, it's the client therapist relationship is the biggest influencing factor. So perhaps it's the coach and the athlete relationship that's the biggest influential factor. But actually, the research is pretty universal on this, that's hugely important. The client therapist relationship is roughly about 30%. If we look at Lambert's research into this, and then we've got the model is roughly about 15%. And then there's hope and placebo is about 15%. Now, the other 40% is extra therapeutic factors. So all of the other things that are going on that you have absolutely no control over in that therapy space. But what you can do in that therapy space is help to get the client to understand their own needs and resources and how to meet them in a healthy way that helps them to build resilience to be able to manage those and influence those extra therapeutic factors. Does that make sense in terms of the work that you do in sport?
100%. Like everything you do on that, and like even on the help side, sometimes they mightn't want help. They're coming to it, but they mightn't want it. So even though I'm doing everything I can, the bit I say about beating myself up by it, if I don't get that outcome in my head, that mightn't be necessarily my fault. There's lots of other factors that come into it. I'm doing everything I can around that. But again, I can't control people.
No. Joe Griffin would always say, have you got a customer for change in the room? Because if you haven't, your work's not going anywhere,
100%. And like the thing we talk a lot about within sport, because we're dealing with lots of other components like coaches, the support staff, the player, is who's the client? Who's the client you're dealing with in this scenario? Because you often get told, well, the coach thinks it's this and this person thinks it's that and you think it's that. And then you actually speak to the athlete and it's something different. And then, okay, who's your client? the client, the athlete, or the organization that's paying you, because they may say, look, it's this. So for example, I've had it before where a coach has asked me, should this person play? And I'm going, that's not my decision. I'm not a coach. I'm not involved in that. But I know you've been doing some work with them. That's irrelevant because that's not my role. And if obviously some individuals you could be under the pressure, well, they're the ones paying me. So are they my client or is my athlete the client? And those things can suddenly then link around.
Ethical boundaries can become quite blurred.
Oh,
How do you manage that?
Really asking your question, like who is the client? What is the aspect? And really being mindful of the decision-making process that goes into it. So for example, if I did disclose to the coach, whether I think, not disclosing what me and the individual says, what it could mean is I've now broken trust with the player, and the rest of the players go, well, hold on a minute, this person went to see Phil and now they're out of the team, and I know that they've spoken. Or the coach goes, well, look, I've spoken with Phil and we think we're going to sit you out on this one. I've got no right over that. I'm not a coach in that field. So my job isn't to say whether they should play or not. My job is to best equip the athletes themselves to be able to manage those situations and those scenarios. So yeah, trying to think about what is the first, second, third order consequences of my actions. And something that got said to me a while ago by a very experienced practitioner was, does the decision need to be made now? Because sometimes we make that instinctive movement and we're thinking we're helping. And it's asking yourself, look, if I did nothing for 24 hours, would anything change? And if the answer is no, then that possibly means you've got time to think about what is the implications and what's the right thing. And again, that thing, who's the client?
Yeah.
Who is the client? When you ask yourself that when you're working in multidisciplinary setups, it allows you to get real clarity about where you sit within that. And also an understanding that since that early experience, I now, whenever I'm kind of being brought in to work with a team, I'm very clear on where I sit, where my process is, what they can expect from me, what success for my role is. Because sometimes it's like, right, bring a psych in, they're going to change your performances around. And it's like, I'm not a motivational speaker. and even so, you might, even if you do find some motivation in what I say, it's not going to necessarily fix all the problems in one session. Your brain is a muscle. It needs to be trained and worked on. So yeah, those kind of fundamental factors.
Yeah. So managing people's expectations from the outset, really, really important, clarifying your role and your responsibilities and the boundaries within which you'll be working.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Because, people's perspectives of what a psychologist can be and the impact, they might expect that they're going to see a huge change after one session, which I've had with young athletes, and the parent will go, right, you've had one session with them and we're still seeing the same problem. And I'm like, exactly. I've had one session with them. I've had an intake interview with the individual. Like it's management of those expectations is key. And sometimes, as you probably know, within the therapy space, people's perspectives and perceptions of what therapy entails, a lot of it comes from the movies in Hollywood, and I still get it, even though I'm in the sports space, that they think I'm going to have a couch in my room, I'm going to get them come in and lie down and tell me about your parents. That's almost that expectation of where it's going to go. And it's like, oh, it's just a conversation. Yeah, that's all it is. We're just going to have a conversation. And it's kind of safe. Yes, we might get into some deeper level talks, and that's okay, but we're not going to dive. I'm not going to take you to the deep end and chuck you in straight away. We'll build to that. And I rambled a bit there. So
no, it's fantastic. It's because it's so much, we work in different arenas, and we've arrived at where we are in, different routes, but actually there's so much overlap in the way that you work and the Human Givens approach. So I'm sure, our listeners are able to really, reflect and see and draw out all of the things that you're saying and be able to, overlay the HG lens to it really, and see that there's so many parallels in the work. You're
dealing with people. That's fundamentally, regardless of the context, the performance.
All got the same physical and emotional needs and are all born with the same resources. And you talked about the importance of language. And I think, if we've got time, that's something I'd like to come back to. But the importance of language as an influencing factor in outcomes. What else do you see as barriers, if you like, to people being able to access their resources and meet their needs?
Yeah, I think expectations are a big one. some of the research I'm doing at the moment is around trying to look at ways we can help athletes in performance settings almost engage in help-seeking behavior. So when we're struggling, that's really difficult. That unfortunately in sport, it might not be until they're almost that breaking point that they want to actually engage in that support. So some of the quotes there, so we had a paper published late last year that you had players talking about the only reason that they went to engage in that support is because they broke down in the training center and were just in tears. And this is in rugby. So you're talking about you obviously can't see me, but in inverted commas, a masculine sport where we don't necessarily want to showcase that. But it's the opposite. You're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with people. There is no such thing as a kind of, okay, this person should not have this person. We all have feelings and emotions, and they come out and they manifest in different ways in terms of how, when we get to that breaking point, how it can kind of come out. But it's about trying to, one, break the stigma that it's okay to not be okay. That's normal. Like, if you think about your career to date so far, if you had to put a percentage of how many days, and even Joe yourself in your career, and I know in my career, how many days have I woken up and been 100%? I would say I'm on the less than 1% of my career to date where I have woken up feeling perfect. Yeah, that's the measuring stick we feel like we should be every day. And so understanding that, yes, it's okay to not be okay, but then the second part is, if we're not okay, we don't necessarily have to settle for that. That shouldn't just be it. Is there support we can do to help? The way I almost look at it is minimize the lower ones. So if we're thinking about the metric of 0 and 10, yes, we're trying to be 7, 8, 9 most of the time. But if we can minimize the amount of times we're down at 1, 2, 3 and increase that, and surely that's a useful thing to be engaging in terms of where we seek support. So yes, it's okay for us to be down at 1, 2, 3. But that doesn't mean that we have to be there by ourselves, and the support we can access around that. So I guess one of the challenges in sport is a real understanding around what 1, 2, 3 looks like, what it feels like, and being able to know what support structure is available to them that they can engage in. And the stuff we're doing at the moment is looking at within the teams themselves, using the language around mental health and developing their mental health literacy skills that they can help facilitate each other. So instead of going, okay, I've noticed one of my teammates is a bit down here, I'm not going to avoid him, I'm going to go over and have a conversation. Can we foster that environment where people are looking out for each other, where it's like, look, it's all right, mate. Yeah, I'm here if you need to talk. And then you can almost be the vehicle that helps bring them towards that support. Because this is just my personal opinion, is that is probably one of the hardest things a human being can do, is ask for help, particularly when they're in a performance setting where it's like, I've had all this training, I should have the ability to perform, and yet I feel like I've got nothing. That's a really, really hard place to be in. So sometimes as human beings, it's not just on themselves to make that decision, because that's one of the hardest things to do. So is there something we could do to help bring them along on that? So yeah, that's, I guess, I don't know if that quite answers your question, Joe.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, from how that kind of fits into our model, really. So we would say that there are 3 reasons why people would suffer from mental ill health. So 3 barriers, if you like, to people being their needs. And the first one being that the environment, very much, the environment is sick, or they're in a toxic environment, and that could be influenced by people around them. That might be a poor sense of safety and security in where they are. So whatever that environment is, and we can get, we can use the word environment in quite a broad term.
Yeah.
And the second one being that there are missing coping skills. So perhaps we haven't learned how to understand our needs and emotions and instincts, and how all of that works. And so is there a way that we can teach people to be able to do that?
And the third one being that perhaps there's disruption to what we would call the internal guidance system. So the way that we engage with the world to be able to meet our needs, and that can be many things. It can be things such as trauma, conditioning, injury, genetic influence as well. So if we can really think about those 3 barriers and what we can be doing to help people to overcome those barriers in whatever context that is for them, then they're going to be more likely to be able to meet their physical and emotional needs in balance.
The only one I'd add as an additional one, not that it's not included within those three, but more just as a highlight of its importance within that, is the support structure that we find ourselves in. And that could fall within the resources, the coping resources we have. It could fall within the environment. But equally, I think it's important to stand as a standalone, that we are social creatures. We don't work well in isolation. Yes, individuals may like they'd be more introverted, they like that aspect, but we crave that connection when we've gone too long without it. So everyone almost has that cup of, so I know there'll be individuals who they might go to social gatherings and they have that social hangover the next day because of actually engaging with lots of people. Okay, but there's still that need that we have that capacity of that engagement. It is important for what we do and for our development, our both cognitive, emotional development, the professional, personal development. So I do think as a standalone in itself, because the environment could just be the performance environment that you're in, the expectations of the hierarchy, the structures, all of those aspects. But fundamentally, even if that environment itself's not great, it's amazing when you're working with teams, how great when you create a really strong supportive unit, it can help individuals with the coping of that environment. Doesn't make the environment right, but we can't necessarily change or control some of those things. And those inherent things can take time to change within the environment. So that would be my only, not addition, but I'd almost take it out as its standalone component, because I do think it's so important that in everything we do, that we talk about the importance of talking. But it's, yes, journaling and things like that, getting it out. But when you talk with other people and they validate your experience or validate your response, that's the bit that's really powerful. So that connection bit is so important for me, that understanding that social bubble.
Totally. I think, what you talk about is that biopsychosocial model of well-being.
Yeah.
That Gareth and I did in universities. He created this model, this performance model, and it was to do with academic performance, but actually you could remove the word academic and it was applicable in anything. And we'd got, it was influenced and it was, multi-directional. The physical needs, the psychological needs, but also the social well-being factor as well. And so it was this triangle feeding into the performance in the middle, and all of those, so your performance can influence the others as well as, the others influencing the performance. So absolutely, totally hear what you're saying with that one. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I love it. And like, there's so much you can learn from other performance domains. It's one of the reasons why I love working in the other ones, because again, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with context, and you're dealing with performance. But fundamentally, at the heart of it is a person, and we have a good idea of what people need to perform.
So how, I was going to talk about that actually. How do you, I know that some of your research has been on understanding the predictors. Can you tell me a bit more about that? How do you know when somebody's more likely to struggle?
Yeah, good question. So I guess from an academic perspective, or with my research hat on, we're trying to look at some of the fundamental traits and trying to understand the relationship that those traits have with certain performance environments. So I looked at more fine motor skills, so the likes of golf, darts, archery, where there's a real element of precision required. So, and that had a huge implication on the outcome. And a lot of those sports are self-paced. So there's almost a conscious decision in when you execute that move. Whereas other sports, if you think of maybe football or rugby, where it's kind of very instinctive. So I may throw a bad pass, doesn't necessarily mean that the performance outcome is going to go down because of it. So what we tried to look at was some of the key aspects that could influence that decision-making aspect, and trying to see if we could predict those individuals who are more likely to experience choking or more likely to experience, the main area of my research is on a phenomenon called the yips, where it's kind of a psychoneuromuscular impediment that stops us from being able to perform. So you may have seen it, darts players who can't release the dart, an elite level golfer who they're putting all the time, suddenly they're gripping the putter too hard and it's jerking and shaking, and trying to understand what potentially influences individuals who experience that. And one of the main things that came out for us was around perfectionistic self-presentation, where it's very much around, I don't want to show you my weaknesses. I don't want to tell you my weaknesses, and I have to present this perfect image. And particularly when you're in those moments where there's a performance outcome element to it, but there's also a level of, I'm being seen here, and I can't be seen to make a mistake. And because that decision making, it de-automatizes your natural movements. Because if you think about, I'm sure parents, if you've got parents here, or you yourself were taught to drive by your parent, it's a really stressful thing. Why? Because driving's very automatic, like it is walking for people. So when you ask to break down how to drive, they struggle massively with it, because they look at it at a very higher level. When you're learning something, it's a very much slower thing. And when we try to do that when we have an automatic movement, it becomes uncoordinated. Okay, so that is why there's that real challenge point. So trying to look at those psychological traits that may cause that interference and cause that breakdown in performance, and definitely perfectionistic self-presentation was one of them. So in terms of how we look at it from a research side, it's again looking at that and testing it in different performance domains to see if its accuracy holds true. But then in the practical side, it's like working as a practitioner in the space, it's trying to use almost triangulation in my methods for my needs analysis. So not just relying on one piece of information to inform my decision on it, trying to see if I can see multiple modes of things that can influence that decision making, because we can very easily make assumptions based off what we see, but we want to almost reaffirm it by what we're hearing and what's actually being presented. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, Jo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure if there are any of our trainees listening, they'll be able to pick out some of the maxims of psychological influence, as we call them in our Human Givens manual you've been talking about there. I might test you on it later, any supervisees of mine who may be listening. Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff. So how do you help people overcome any of these things that they're experiencing?
How do you help people? Good question. For me, fundamentally, and again, this sits from, I guess, my philosophical approach, my values as a practitioner, is I very much support the person behind the performer. So I want to really understand them, the challenges that they're facing, and really understand them as people. Because when you support people, my view is you support the better version of a performer. You're helping them to be better performers. Because almost, if you think about it, we take our baggage with us, and I don't necessarily mean baggage in the sense of all our challenges, but if I go into my work and my son's in hospital sick, I'm not going to be working at the best of my capacity, because me as a person has challenges going on. So it's about holistically supporting that individual. When it comes to actual performance issues, it's really just getting them to understand what their definition of success and failure is, because there's so much variation in what's understood by that. And you start to understand some of the expectations people place on themselves, the expectations that they perceive others are placing on them, and really trying to seek evidence of that fact and very much using it like that. So is that a fact? Have you heard someone say that? Or is that just you're perceiving that based on body language or what you're seeing or that? And really trying to understand that, where they're getting the evidence for why they think their performance is breaking down. And then once we kind of get to some of those aspects, trying to really create a more healthy way of viewing it, a more helpful way of viewing it, and also then really trying to give them mental processes that allow them to have a routine that can be consistent, that they know they can fall back into, that they know if they start to waver slightly, they've got something they're able to grab on and bring them back onto a more even keel. And there's no unfortunate golden blueprint of what's going to work for everyone. It is a very personal aspect. So it's really helping them to navigate what that's going to look like. If we're going to use cues, what cues are going to hit and have the same effect? If we're going to be using imagery or breathing, or some might sit with mindfulness. So nice one could be, okay, do we want to get really present focus when there's lots of noise going on that's going to bring us, we don't need to listen to it, but we can't get rid of it, so let's bring it down? Or do we want to challenge the thoughts and go with more of a maybe a CBT, REBT approach of challenge our thoughts, challenge our beliefs. And again, you only really know that by getting to know the person, their appraisal of the situation and the demand itself. So I don't know if I've given a core specific, just do this, because it's not that simple.
No, absolutely. It's so important to listen to the individual story, isn't it? And the language that the individual is using themselves, and how you, as part of that support network, can help them to perhaps reframe and rephrase some of the way that they're speaking to themselves, and to help shape that story slightly differently for them. And is there any work, I mean, I did say I just wanted to touch briefly, because we're close to time now, but is there any work involved in the way language is used in the sector? I know this is something, I was speaking to somebody the other day in the world of dance who's very keen to educate people in the world of dance about the importance of language. Is that something that's going on in sport as well?
Yeah, definitely. I know from an overview, this win at all costs mentality that was in sport definitely had a lot of ramifications in terms of mental health and the implications of that. And that is the language of it. Yeah. And the language pertaining that, maybe that's in actions of coaches, but also in the expectation setting that we need to win at all costs. That comes at a do or die element to it. So in terms of within the sector of sport, it is really trying to understand that in any competition, like if you think of any sport you compete, and I do this with my young athletes, actually, at a session during the week, and I ask them, okay, when you turn up to competitions, how many people are there? And they'd go, there might be 20 in a league, or there might be 200. And I was like, so who walks away with a gold medal? One person. Does that mean the other 399 or 9 are unsuccessful? Does that mean that they've failed? Fundamentally, no. But it's then that understanding of the language we use to ourselves, whether it's the restrictive language as I should, have to, need to. We know that's not helpful because it restricts you in a box that there's only one outcome that's viewed as success. So understanding the relationship that we have in the language we use around success, failure, fundamentally is a really useful starting block. And well, what is the definition of success? What is the definition of success that you feel is required from you within your sport? That's required from you, from your parents? Because I would say in youth sport, that's a majority of the problem we face is, or the biggest thing that athletes I know will say is the biggest source of pressure is, I want to feel that the money my parents have spent and the time my parents have given up has been worthwhile. And then when you speak to the parents, they're often, I don't care as long as they're having fun. Yeah. So the language isn't translating there. No. So those types of things are really, again, really important. So from a organizational level, the win at all costs thing and the language and how that's presented and how you communicate expectations, massive. But then within the individuals themselves or the teams, again, how those values, how those expectations, how those understanding of what success looks like definitely need to be verbalized. They need to be articulated from the individuals, but also within the support staff to know what we expect in here. Is that realistic? Is that fair? Because sometimes those are the biggest barriers athletes face, because it's like, okay, are you someone who enjoys competing when you've got no expectation? That's different to when the target's on your back and you've just won and everyone's coming for your spot. And again, being able to verbalize and understand the language individuals say to themselves around that is so important. So important.
I think, the language as well is changing the way that language is used in sport is going to go a long way as well to help break down the stigma that there is around mental health in sport as well. And I know so much has been done in more recent years. So many amazing athletes coming forward and talking about their own experiences of mental health, which has been so hugely, hugely helpful. But I think, rather than waiting until somebody's had this horrific experience to the point where they've made a documentary about their horrific experience, if we can start to influence that from the beginnings, from when our children are going into cricket clubs and football clubs or athletics, whatever it is, if that can begin at that level with the way that
the last Olympics really set that up with Simone Biles when she came out and said, I'm not competing because of the impact on my mental health. And the research I'm taking part of in Ireland, so it's with rugby, they've got an amazing campaign called Tackle Your Feelings. Yeah, and that's such a powerful thing because the tackle component of rugby, that side. So the thing I would say to everyone is don't underestimate the power of language. And a simple word like should, need can change the whole perspective of how that's perceived and how that's viewed. And just talking more about using the term mental health, my mental well-being, my emotional well-being, normalizes it, because we're normal, we're human beings, we all feel it. So let's talk about it. It's not something that just impacts 5% of the population. Mental health is not, there's no bigotry in it, there's no sexism in it, there's no racism in it. We're human beings, we experience all of it. We experience these feelings, we experience in all those aspects that, so let's talk about it.
And so we have. And thank you, Phil. Amazing. Is there anything else at all that, that you'd particularly like to add today?
Ed, the only thing I would say, just from my own experience, because I know you are in the mental health counselling space or psychotherapy space, is learn from other professions. Because all other professions, one of the things I love, I work with health psychs, I've worked with clinical psychs, I've worked with psychotherapists, I've worked with forensic psychs, organizational psychs. They're all dealing with people, so I can learn from it. So don't restrict yourself too much with just learning from my sector.
Yeah.
But learn from anyone who works with people. There's learning to be had. So yeah, just from a development point, reach out. You might think, oh, he's a sports psychologist, that's got nothing to do with me. Hopefully you've learned today. Oh, actually, yeah, they're dealing with people, so they're dealing with challenge, they're dealing with pressure. Okay, there's a lot of crossover, and learning from those other disciplines is within psychology is been hugely powerful for my own development as a practitioner, as a researcher, as a lecturer, but also as a person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think absolutely, Gareth and I would back you up totally on that. Read across a broader scope rather than just in your area, and listen to podcasts like this one. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights that you've shared no doubt will help a lot of people, listening to this podcast and sharing it beyond across a broader scope rather than just in your area. And listen to podcasts like this one. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights that you've shared no doubt will help a lot of people, listening to this podcast and sharing it beyond.
If you would like to explore the Human Givens approach and the training we offer, you can find out more by visiting our website, and you can find the link for that in the podcast description, where you'll also find the links for many of the resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our podcast archive. We've been lucky enough to speak to so many interesting people on the Good Mental Health podcast and on such a wide range of topics. But if there's something that you would like us to cover, please do let us know. And of course, if you enjoyed listening today, please like, comment and share. But for now, thank you to everyone for listening, and until next time, goodbye.